Good morning, everybody. The webinar will begin very shortly. We'll just take a few moments while we wait for everybody to join the call. Morning, everybody. We're just waiting for everyone to join the call. I can see we've still got people coming in, so we'll wait a few moments. So good morning, everyone. I'm Siobhan Bonita. I'm a former UK senior civil servant, and I'm delighted to be here this morning for our webinar looking at kind of demystifying lots of things to do with Whitehall and Westminster. So demystifying the structures, the responsibilities, how Whitehall and government works. Understanding Whitehall and Westminster can be a daunting challenge, even for people like me who have been interacting professionally with government for many years. Some of the practices, the procedures, the conventions, the relationships can be really complicated to navigate. So today we are going to try and kind of answer your questions on those to demystify some of this. And this is one of a series of webinars that we're going to be doing on kind of how things work across government and Whitehall. And at the end, I'll tell you a bit more about the others that are coming up. But today we're going to start by, in particular, looking at these areas. So we're going to look at kind of how government and Whitehall are organised, where the power lies in government, what the operational structures are, so how things get done. We're going to look at what a civil servant is, because actually I think there's been quite a lot of confusion and maybe misinformation about that, especially in the run up to the election, what civil servants do, and then how policy is made in practice. And all the while we're doing this, we'll be thinking about how you, our audience, because I think a lot of you might be potential partners, suppliers to government, how you fit in this kind of picture. I have two fantastic colleagues with me here today, and I'm going to kind of put some questions to them about those areas. And I hope that will help provide some of the answers to you that you might have. But we are going to make sure there's lots of time for you, once you've heard from our two speakers, to put your questions to Zoe and James. So whichever device you are using, there should be a Q&A button on your device. Please do use that opportunity, this opportunity to message in your questions. And we really want this to be a conversation. So as I say, there are no silly questions here. Like a lot of this stuff can be really confusing. So please, I don't want you to leave this webinar thinking, I still don't know that, I should have asked this. Please do put your questions to us, and we'll get through as many of those as we can before the end of the webinar. But just to introduce my two fantastic colleagues, so first we will be hearing from James Humphreys, who is, both of these are Global Government Forum Associate Policy Trainers. And James is also the director of the Research and Engagement Consultancy, Wood Newton. And before co-founding this consultancy, James was head of corporate communications in the Prime Minister's office, where he actually launched the first mobile app for government. And James also worked in the Department of Environment on housing and regional development policies, and spent 2 years in Brussels as the UK's rep to the European Union on environment policy. And then we're also going to hear from Zoe Collier, who is also a visiting professor in international politics at the College of Europe. And Zoe worked for over 30 years in and with the civil service and international administrations, including in Treasury, in the diplomatic service, in culture, media and sport, and was also a private secretary to a cabinet minister. So really has kind of both our speakers, as you can see, have had that great experience right at the heart of government, as well as in some of the government departments. So there are two fantastic kind of colleagues here today, and I'm going to kick off, I think, first by going back to the organisational structures. And James, I think it's safe to say, I think over the last few weeks, we've seen a lot of kind of these issues in the run up to the election. And then I think all of us will have seen those images on the day of the results of the outgoing Prime Minister heading to Buckingham Palace, and then really soon afterwards, the new Prime Minister doing the same, going to the palace, meeting the King, and then heading over to number 10. So can you explain a bit more about why this happens? I think it's unique, obviously, in the UK, why this happens and where this kind of handover of power fits in the wider organisation of the UK government.
Sure, thanks for that, and I appreciate exactly as you say. This is Constitution of the United Kingdom is a very, very complicated beast, and it would be fun to spend time going down some of the byways, the curiosities. We're not going to be discussing so much, well, whether it's which bit of empty your bins goes to which council. It's much more, I think, about approaching these things in terms of some of potentially, perhaps for our audience today, the question of decision making. So how are decisions made? That's really the heart of why government exists. Therefore, it's largely dealing with problems. Those problems come in big and small sizes. So you have levels of government. Sitting right at the top in a symbolic way, but not just symbolic way, is the monarchy. We then have the Prime Minister who is there to advise the monarch. But of course, over the years, over centuries, this has been inverted. So effectively, all the power of the monarchy has transferred nominally to Parliament, but because Parliament has changed over time as well, that a lot of that power has moved up to the Prime Minister. So we live in an era in which people talk about a presidential Prime Minister, a Prime Minister who can take decisions really without a great deal of reference, perhaps, to other parts of these structures. And we've seen times in which that's been quite extreme, and there's been a question as to whether prime ministers have the right advice and take the right decisions. So when we're looking at that handover of power, like where the power is brought in a smart car up the mall to Buckingham Palace, it's handed by the departing prime minister to the king. The king takes that and passes it both to the prime minister and then to the cabinet ministers in a different ceremony. That's a symbol of the authority of the monarchy, which is near absolute, being passed. Now, where we can perhaps think then about decisions is if you think about all those decisions that can be taken, and that is everything about whether the country goes to war, down to what colour are we going to paint the door of the library in Oakham. Those decisions, and there are literally billions of them, those decisions are taken at different levels, but the power, and probably Zoe's going to be talking about the power structures more in a moment, but that power, in theory, all starts with the king and then goes to Parliament. Parliament then is the term sovereign. It can sort of do what it likes, and then that passes down to the Prime Minister, and then the Prime Minister passes it down to a very, very large number of different structures. So we've got something where we have these levels and we have a certain element of complexity, but decision making, who's taking which decisions, is probably your best guide to approaching this very, very large and complicated beast. One other thing just to play into this, another aspect of it, is rights. Now, that applies to us as individuals, but it also as bits of government. So what is really striking about the UK system and very different from most other countries is there is no written constitution, and that includes not writing down what it is that each bit of the system can do. So if Parliament decides to do away with local government can't stop it. All the power sits in Parliament. If the Prime Minister commands a majority in Parliament, it will go through. Similarly, devolution. The Welsh government, the Scottish government, the Northern Ireland Assembly, Stormont, they have been given quite a lot of power, but that power can be taken away in a day. If Parliament wants to push legislation through to abolish those institutions, constitutionally, there's nothing to stop Parliament doing that. So the absence of a written constitution means that there's almost a built-in instability, because these are not things that would require change to the constitution, which in most other countries would require a popular vote and perhaps even a majority beyond 50 plus one person, a more substantial majority, 60% sold to adjust. So what we have is lots and lots of power concentrated in the centre, but practical reasons it's given out to others. And that's where we'll be looking as we go on to looking not only at Parliament, but also Whitehall, the civil service, and devolution and down into local government as to who's doing what.
And yeah, and
Um,
I just want to touch on that you mentioned devolution there kind of in passing. And I know we can't go into there's so much to cover, as I say, we're going to have to stagger this over several webinars, I think. But devolution, I mean, there was so much I felt in the run up to this general election talk about Scotland and how Scotland was going to vote, Wales, whether it voted a certain way or whatever. Can you just tell us a little bit? How does that work with devolution? So in the general election, people are also obviously voting across all parts of the nation. But how does that fit with the devolved powers that you have in kind of the Scottish Parliament and the Northern Ireland Assembly? And how does that all fit together?
well, arguably, it doesn't really fit together very well. So one of the things you look at is where Parliament, the MPs we vote in the general election, they sit in Parliament, they're taking UK-wide decisions. But then a lot of the everyday stuff in areas like health and education, and increasingly even in taxation, they're being passed down to a devolved body, not always the same powers to each one, just to make it more complicated. Now, at that point, we're looking at structures in which the devolution goes down, and then there's a responsibility. There's elections. People have a mandate. So, for example, particularly the Scottish government, has in many ways, a very clear mandate, but it doesn't have an independent legal or constitutional position, and so that can make it very complicated. So, what is the British, we might think of as the British Parliament, it's also the English Parliament. So all of those matters, if they're not devolved, are being dealt with
Right.
by Westminster, which is our kind of shorthand, the Palace of Westminster for the political those people who've been elected to serve in the UK Parliament. So yeah, devolution is again a strange beast. These organisations, although they have a parliament and they have people being elected and they have a mandate and they have the turnout and the rest of it, they don't have an independent existence, and therefore, what
Just to
is
be clear,
devolved or
they
not can
they weren't
change.
being elected at the same time as we were having the general election. There's separate elections for those.
That's right.
Great. Thanks, James. I know there's loads we can cover, and please do get your questions coming in because we're just going to kind of set the scene with some of this conversation, but we want to know what you want to hear about. And Pippa has already said, are we going to share the slides of the recording? Yes, we will. Pippa, don't worry about that. We will be sharing the link with people so that you can just listen now and then you'll have all this information afterwards. So Zoe, I'm going to come to you. So James did mention there about the kind of power being concentrated at the center of our system. And we've already had, I mean, it's only been kind of a matter of days, just, a week since the election result. And we've had a raft of announcements, I think. And most of those, I think it's fair to say, have been coming from right at the centre of government. So we've heard things coming out of number 10 and to an extent Treasury. So can you tell us, is that normal? And is that really where we're saying the power lies? Can you give us a bit of sense of where power actually lies in the UK government?
Yeah, absolutely. It is pretty normal, actually. If you think back over time, that the relationship between a prime minister and the chancellor of the exchequer has always been, really at the heart of the. Sorry, my video's gone off for
That's
some
okay.
reason.
There we
There
go.
we go.
You're back. Yeah.
Has always really been at the heart of driving forward government policy. So if you think back, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, George Osborne, that relationship's absolutely seminal, I think, to enabling a government to be really active and be seen to be active. So the relationship between the Prime Minister and the Treasury is, in fact, the Prime Minister has an official title of First Lord of the Treasury. So it's not like the Chancellor is in charge of the money and the Prime Minister's got no say. No, they have to work really closely together. But also we've got the Cabinet Office, which is the Cabinet Office is there to really drive forward what the government wants to achieve, to make sure that it's all properly coordinated across different government departments. We've got Pat McFadden, who's been a little bit in the shadows, I think. He's obviously a very influential, very experienced, but he's been given this wonderful title of the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. But effectively, he is going to be there really making sure that the government delivers on its priorities. So I think there is between number 10 Cabinet Office and Treasury, I think that's where the real powerhouse in government is. But we've also got other departments which are going to be really key to delivery. So I think, housing is a big issue for the government. So the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government has just changed its name, which is where the Deputy Prime Minister is Secretary of State. So Home Office, Justice, there's going to be an announcement by the Secretary of State for Justice this afternoon. So there are other announcements coming out that are kind of niche to particular policy areas, but I think the main thrust of this is who we are, this is what we're going to be doing, is very much going to come from the centre.
Thanks, Zoe. So you mentioned kind of Cabinet Office as that coordination role, but also the kind of powerhouse driving delivery. But James, I want to come back. We haven't yet talked about, so we're putting a picture up there of Cabinet. So if the power is lying in Cabinet Office, what's the role of Cabinet? Who is the Cabinet? Like, who are they? And also you can see there in that picture, there's the Cabinet Secretary. So sitting to the right of Keir Starmer is Simon Case, who's the current Cabinet Secretary. What's the role of the Cabinet Secretary in all of this? And that starts to bring in, I guess, where did the civil service come into this kind of picture?
So yeah, so one way of thinking of it is as a sort of power, a structure which does what the people around the cabinet table decide. So where you have a cabinet, and again, there's people sort of cheating, you may have heard this debate about how much power do they actually have, who takes the decisions, but essentially, cabinet is doing two things. It's a series of people who have been appointed to run a department or a ministry, and so they'll have their responsibility. It'll be health, it'll be education, and so they're sitting on top of a pyramid of people who are there to do their work, who are almost all civil servants, and then they've also got they're given by the Treasury, hopefully, a big part of cash to help make that happen and operate the system, or indeed make changes to the system through Parliament. So that's where those cabinet ministers are coming from, in the sense that they are to some extent representing an area of policy, but they're also in theory and sometimes in practice working collectively as the government that as a whole is taking a view about where the government should be and how it responds particularly to unforeseen events. And so what we've got is like two people at the top of those two pyramids. We've got the Prime Minister, who is the most senior of all those ministers appointed by the Crown to advise the Crown, i.e. do the actual running of the country. And then the head of the civil service is the person who is the leader of those people sitting in each of those pyramids in each of those ministries. And so again, their role is partly to manage and represent the civil service, but they also have a specific job as Cabinet Secretary, which is to advise the Prime Minister and the Cabinet about the decision-making process that they're taking. So that is a role which is responsible for framing the materials that come in front of Cabinet, to running the agenda, and also to taking a note of what comes out of Cabinet, which then is, if like, the orders from Cabinet that disseminate down through the system. And they also have an advisory role. They are influential because they are the people who will be at the Prime Minister's side and to some extent at the side of other ministers when there's a crisis. So it's also looking for someone to fill that role who has a lot of experience and judgment, and can be the person the Prime Minister turns to, who has years of experience, which often ministers just don't have.
Yeah, and I think it might surprise some people that the Cabinet Secretary sits there and literally takes handwritten notes, is literally the secretary to that cabinet meeting, takes handwritten notes, which become the historic record of those cabinet meetings. And it's just, I think it's quite an interesting thing to see in this digital age, that you have the Cabinet Secretary there doing the handwritten notes of the cabinet meetings. And just to let people know in the audience, I think Simon Case has already announced, which is not unusual, I think, given that he's been there a while, that he will see through this kind of transition of power from one government to another, but that he is planning, I think, to stand down, to kind of retire or move on to his next role, probably at the beginning of the new year, I think. And I think that's we've seen that happen in the past as well. So fantastic. We've got lots of questions coming in. I'm just Christina, she's saying, is there a chart reflecting the power relationships? Christina, I'm sure we have one of those in some of the training that we do. So we'll see if we can dig that out for you behind the scenes. And Walter, could you I'm not sure I understand your question. If you could just give a follow-up with some more information on what you mean, just unpick that a little bit, then we can put that question, I can put that question to James and Zoe in a moment. But James, keeping on this, you were talking about kind of the civil service kind of sitting maybe underneath these kind of ministerial decisions and ready to kind of advise on those decisions, but also then take action. So can you explain a little bit? Because I think this is in particular where our audience, who are potential partners and suppliers to government, I think the majority of the people watching here. So how are the kind of policy announcements? What happens? How do those then get put into practice? And what are the kind of operational structures then that sit underneath these policy decisions, both across Whitehall, but also you mentioned kind of right out to kind of painting that door in a library somewhere, so right out to the broader public sector?
Yes, and again, and this is where there are to answer the question, there are diagrams, but they're always the diagrams where somebody shows you and goes, of course, it's not exactly like that, or well, this works here, but it doesn't work there, and so they do help, and it is good to have them. But sometimes it's just a sheer level of difference that we see in the system that is the thing that we have to acknowledge, and that means it's more of a journey, a voyage of discovery, than it is necessarily going, oh, okay, somebody can just give me some clear statements on these things. So, but to take your point, I mean, maybe just take an example, because there could be thousands of decisions. I mean, even the manifesto itself will have, you know, many policy commitments in it. So how do they actually engage from somebody having written them in a manifesto to ending up on you know, in our lived experience? So it depends on what sort of decisions they are, where the money's coming from. Is it coming from government? Is it government then going to legislate? So it's going to make other people do things. So we're looking more there at some of the regulation. We've also got a specific case, and I think maybe we'll come back to it, which is the thing around how decision-making interacts with the more formal procurement routes, because I think that's often very difficult for people on the outside to get their heads around. But once you do, it makes the procurement process much easier. Or, you know, improves the chances of success. So if I just take one example, in the manifesto, Labour manifesto, so that's coming in, there was a commitment to increase tree planting in the UK, and this is for the objectives, you know, would be people's health and well-being, biodiversity, and climate change. So there was a big policy aims, and they come out in this really quite tangible idea that there will be millions of new trees planted. And I've chosen this as an example because we're not going to have a controversy. I think everyone would say, yeah, that's probably a pretty good idea. So then what happens next? Well, the department who would be responsible for that, it's almost certainly going to be the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA. They would have a policy officials who would look at that and go, right, this is our area of responsibility, woodlands, rural, farms, fine. How do we turn this into a reality? And they would have looked at that before the election, planning to see, you know, whoever the great British public elects, that you're then able as civil servants to come in impartially. You've been given a mandate by the public voting in the MPs who've elected government, who choose a government, and then they then are able to issue you with instructions. And your job is just to do it. It's not to go, oh, I don't agree with this. That your job in a democracy as a civil servant is to say, the people have spoken, and we're now going to follow up on that. So they would then have a plan that would involve finance. So they go, how are we going to fund this if we need money? So there'd be discussions with Treasury. It would be, are there implications for other departments, such as, is it going to have an effect on transport, you know, which could be negative? You know, if is a Network Rail cutting down more trees than we're going to plant, that wouldn't look good. It could be positive. Could we plant trees along motorways, working with the Highways Agency, which is part of the Department of Transport? So internal government coordination, the Cabinet Office plays a big role in enabling that and getting departments to talk to each other. I mentioned there the Highways Agency. So you've got ministries, departments, but they have these semi-autonomous organizations, and they would have a role. So you know, the Environment Agency, or as I said, the Highways Agency. So these are bodies where Parliament has allowed a body to be created. It may have a board of, you know, relatively independently minded people, but they will be appointed by the Secretary of State, the minister at the top of the relevant department to which they apply. So they will be taking more operational matters off, and if you like, getting their sleeves rolled up and getting stuck in. But they on their own might be saying, look, we are government. It's not for the government to set up a tree agency and go out and start buying fields and planting trees. We don't really know how to do that. It wouldn't be very efficient. Who can we work with And this is where we get into partnerships. So what's the first thing you would be doing, and you'd hope a well-run well-run ministry would already have this, is officials who know who the partners could be. They would have connections with the Country Landowners Association or the National Farmers Union, people who've got land which you would need to plant the trees. They may well be, you'd expect they would be talking to organisations like the Woodland Trust, who have vast experience, or they know how to plant millions of trees because they do it on behalf of their members and people giving them grants. So at this sort of stage, you're then reaching out to try and pull together all the people who could play a part in this. And then at the end of the day, you may even get down to saying, right, we've got the Ministry of Defence, they've got some spare land, we've got some money that we want to do. Maybe the fastest way is just to plant up some land, and we'd get a contractor in. And so 3 months down the track, when the policy's been developed and signed off by the minister, maybe even gone to cabinet to be signed off, Treasury have signed it off, it could end up with a procurement tender that says to the industry, if you like, we want 1 million trees planted near this air base, and the quotes will come in as to how much per tree, and then you've even got a procurement contract that's coming out of that policy process. So that's a very rushed view of how a policy in the manifesto can come down. I haven't talked about devolved administrations or local government. They would be playing a part as well.
Yeah, thanks. So you're really giving a sense of kind of there's this huge network, I think. So a policy gets announced, but it has to go through kind of departments, arm's length bodies, agencies, communities to actually get delivered out onto the ground. So it gives us that real sense of the broader kind of ecosystem. But Zoe, I want to just come back a little bit to before any of that happens, the civil servants at that, working in Whitehall. And we've got a picture here of Rachel Reeves, and I think this is a picture of her with, on the day when she went into Treasury last Friday, surrounded by Treasury officials, Treasury civil servants. And I think there's some confusion. I certainly get asked quite a lot as an ex-civil servant, what is a civil servant? Like, what do they actually do? And I think there's quite a lot of confusion. Are they political? Are they not political? What's their function? So I wonder if you could just step back a little bit and just explain very simply, what is a civil servant? What do they actually do? What's their role in kind of even setting off that policy-making process that James was talking about?
Yeah, sure. So the civil service is huge. I mean, it's about 500,000 people, half of whom are very front-facing. So, if you're claiming benefits or you get paid pension, you will come across those people who are in very strongly operational roles. So that's roughly half the number of civil servants who do that. Civil service is a permanent structure, as in if there is a change of government, as we've just seen, the civil service doesn't, as would happen in the United States, it doesn't pack up its boxes and leave the office. It continues. And the job of the civil service is to support the government of the day in delivering what that government has set out in its manifesto and other decisions that it takes. So it's politically impartial, and that's a really important principle, that you provide completely objective, impartial advice to ministers, and that regardless of your politics, you deliver what they have set out that they want to set out in their manifesto and beyond. So there are lots of I think the civil service is one of the great beauties of it, and one of the reasons I loved being a civil servant. It's so varied. There's such a lot of choice. So there are different professions within the civil service. So we have a commercial stream who handle contracts and the like. You've got the specialist analytical people, so statisticians, economists, legal. You've got the policy profession, and those are the people who very much will be that starting point of taking a government commitment and giving advice to the minister responsible on options for the best way of delivering that. So essentially, the policy people do a huge amount of work sort of gathering evidence and providing that objective advice. So people will see a lot of civil servants in their day-to-day life, the people on the front line, job centres and places, but a lot of it happens behind the scenes. And one thing I was going to say as well is that the civil service provides a really valuable service to the government because it provides that impartial, balanced, objective advice. And the principle of impartiality is a crucial one. But of course, ministers are political people. So there are these other people called special advisors, or often shortened to SPADs, who are they are bound by all the terms of the Civil Service Code of Conduct, except for the one around impartiality. So these people are political, and they're appointed from the centre, so by the Prime Minister. And they are an additional source of advice to the ministers. So the civil service will say, we consider this to be the best way forward in delivering your priority. And the special advisors will say, yep, I can see why they've recommended that, but you know what, that's not going to go down well in that very marginal constituency. So sometimes I think even civil servants think, why on earth did the minister follow my advice? Because of politics. So I think it's a really important distinction between the political advisors and the non-political civil servants here.
Brilliant. Thanks, Zoe. There's loads of questions coming in. You've definitely got everybody engaged, I think, both you and this. So really interesting in what you're saying there, in that because I think this is really important, because why should people know what a civil servant does? Because I think nobody's taught this stuff. It's only when you come into contact and you start working with government, maybe you need to know more. So there are civil servants who work in Whitehall. There are civil servants who work in other parts of the public sector, some on the front line, as you say. But the key thing is, in the UK, civil servants are impartial. They're not political. We have special advisors who come into the system who bring the political aspects in, and that advice goes up to ministers. And the job of civil servants, I think, is to take what ministers want to deliver and provide options, the best way in which you can deliver that policy, those decisions, using with public money in mind. So what's best value for money, and lots of other considerations they have to take into account, don't they? The impact on the environment, impact on equality. There's lots of things now in a policy submission that they have to kind of include. And I just wondered, Zoe, I know time is tight, but James gave the example of the tree, kind of planting trees, an example of how policy is made. Did you want to add anything in terms of how does policy get made in practice?
Yeah, there isn't a sort of one size fits all on this one, but every government department has a what they call a policy cycle, so a process through that civil servants are supposed to work through in order to develop the best possible policy and policy advice.
Yeah.
So essentially, it all starts with the government's priorities here, and then how does the minister responsible want to what do they want that policy to do? So government makes all sorts of different types of policy. They're the ones where we are doing things to people, like education. That's children don't have any choice. They get education whether they like it or not. You can do things for people, so you can provide services, or you can do things with people. So a lot of policy is done by a great deal of consultation with people who are affected by a problem that government's trying to solve, who perhaps the people who are causing the problem that government's trying to solve, to really look at why is this happening? What ideas are there out there for making that change? Really gathering as much evidence as possible. But clearly there are times when government has to act really fast, and there won't be as much evidence as we might like. So if you think back to the beginning of the COVID pandemic, governments across the world, one of the problems was that the scientists knew all about coronaviruses. They just didn't know anything about COVID-19. So, and yet a government had to act. You can't just sort of say, "Oh, let's wait and see." So decisions have to be taken in the absence of evidence. But what's really important here is, from the start, you're thinking about how are we going to implement a solution, and how are we going to monitor the effectiveness of it as it's being delivered, so that if necessary we can tweak and adjust it. So there's a huge amount of complexity around policy making, but
Yeah.
there are some sort of staple steps to it, I would say.
Yeah, thanks, Zoe. We've got loads of questions. I'm going to come to the questions in just a moment, but a colleague has messaged me saying I need to clarify something on the Cabinet Secretary. Everything I mentioned had been profiled in the press a lot, but there's no confirmation of the time in which Simon Case will be handing over, kind of to a new Cabinet Secretary, which makes, so there's no exclusive here, guys. Nothing has been announced today, but which made me think, James, in terms of kind of all of this, we haven't mentioned the media. To what extent does the media play a role in how policy and decision making ultimately gets made and influencing kind of government, and ministers?
No, it's a good point, because it's almost the end of the pipe that we're describing, where we've got the king and the prime minister and the rest of it. So in one sense, the power is sitting with a small group of people, or even arguably just with the prime minister, because if the prime minister wants to fire a cabinet minister, they can. Constitutionally, they can. But then there's this whole other side, which is politics. And politics isn't just every 4 or 5 years when we elect people in an electoral cycle. It's also what or is this sort of nebulous notion of what the public thinks focused through the media. So if a policy, you might have the power to do a policy, but you look at it and going, it won't fly. It won't fly because the public won't put up with it, or interest groups won't put up with it. And the main way that is mediated, and we know about it, and those campaigning groups or the public voice, is through the media. So the media has an absolutely critical role in shaping mainly the politicians, but also the civil service. What can we actually do? If maybe trees aren't one example of that, but for example, there's a big push at the moment about using drones for deliveries. Well, there may be a point at which the public go, I don't want drones flying up and down my street 10 feet over my head like a giant insect. And suddenly you'll have pushback. And that is not something that will necessarily come through the traditional electoral cycle of manifestos and the rest of it. It's just the public going, wait a minute, we don't want this. The media will pick up on that, campaigners would pick up on that, and politicians are then going, we may in theory have the power to do it, but we can't do it. And that's why the relationship between, to some extent, certainly the ministers, the media and the public, is about the permission to do it and the acceptability of making some of these decisions.
Thanks. So the last thing before we go to all the questions that are coming in, I just wanted to highlight a couple of opportunities for everybody who's listening, where you can engage more with kind of officials in the new government through Global Government Forum and the various channels that we have. And again, we'll send you all of this, so don't worry, you will get all of this after the webinar as well. But we have multiple channels where we bring together public servants, so senior officials and civil servants, with private sector partners. So we've put on the screen there just some of those. We've got a whole host of webinars like this, but also webinars where we bring together kind of serving civil servants with private sector knowledge partners. We do a series of podcasts where we interview leading civil servants from all around the world, actually, not just here in the UK. We do lots of publishing, got a great website full of great content on there. We commission research and do thought leadership, and we do a load of training, which I'll come on to in a minute. But we just something to highlight immediately, I think, is we do run these big kind of in-person events and conferences as well. And one really to note, if you're interested in kind of really getting in quite quickly with what's happening in the new kind of government, we've got an event called Public Service Data Live on the 19th of September in London. Last year was the inaugural one of these. Fantastic event where we did have the Cabinet Secretary and a lot of senior civil servants who are really focused on that kind of transformation and modernization, which is very much being led by digital transformation. We've got that coming up on the 19th of September. So if you're interested in that and want to be involved in that, please do get in touch. All the information will be sent to you and it's there on the screen as well. And then we also run a huge annual event. I think we had nearly, or maybe even over 2,000 civil servants at this event, which is called Innovations. That cuts across all of the professions, all of the policy areas. And that's going to be actually over 2 days next year. So that's on the 25th and the 26th of March next year, again, in London. And I think by then we'll really understand the direction in which this new government is going. So there'll be lots of things to talk about in terms of innovation. AI was a big theme last year. I'm sure it will be a big theme again this year for the innovation event. And then, as I mentioned as well, we do a whole load of training. So today we're really just skating over the surface of a lot of these things. But if you are interested in a deeper dive into some issues around kind of government and digital, governance and strategy, regulation, there's a whole list of things there. Or if you or your organization would like us to develop some bespoke training for you, we are very happy to do that as well. So that's just running through some of the things that we can offer. So please do have a good look at those, and then we're very happy to discuss further with you if there are things that you are interested in. But as I said, we have got loads of questions coming in. So I'm going to go over to the questions now. So thanks to James and Zoe for setting the scene and giving us that insight. So Greg, I'm going to go to Greg's question. And this comes back to, which I really like, I think, James, this was something you touched on. Is there a general rule as to which manifesto or policy commitments require legislation, or which ones can just be actioned straight away? And interesting, my daughter was asking me this the other day, because she was saying, God, it sounds like they're doing things really quickly. Doesn't this have to go through some kind of process? So James, and then Zoe, if you want to come in, how is that decided?
Well, in one sense, yeah, it is. The civil service has quite a lot of lawyers, and their main role really is to say, are you allowed to do this or not internally? So everything that the government does ought to have a legal basis for doing it. It should be that it can only do it because Parliament has voted it the powers to do so. So when I was saying about a grant scheme, a government just can't give money to people. It has to have a legal base for doing even something as uncontroversial as that. So yes, there are some things where the legal structure is already in place. So if it's grants to local authorities, that will almost certainly be in place. Some of the more not novel things, yeah, and then there's an issue, which is how do you get time in Parliament to get that legislation through? And that's another reason for delay that can come up, because sometimes people go, why don't they just do it? Well, it can be as simple as just not having capacity in Parliament to pass the legislation.
Brilliant. So essentially the thing is does this already come within existing legislation? So the power's already there. And then if it doesn't, is this going to be priority for us to try and get through Parliament in this term? And there will be a prioritising going on. So is there anything you wanted to add there in terms of deciding whether it needs legislation or not?
Yeah, I think one of the things is, legislation, as James says, it can be time consuming trying to get it through Parliament, and the legislative programme is always tight. So what government needs to think about sometimes is legislation the right way to do things? Because effectively, what government policy is all about is trying to get people to change behaviour. The problems that it's trying to tackle are caused by individuals or, by pockets of society or what have you. So there are choices. You can try the hard levers, so introducing legislation or tweaking existing legislation, or there are the softer ones, which are more around persuasion, education, behavioural insights, bringing behavioural insights in. There's a lot of work around government on that, about how do you give people the information that enables them to take those choices for themselves. So, often there's a bit of a carrot and stick approach that, if you can get people to do things differently, if you think about, some of the things that we have got very used to, in the, like wearing seatbelts in cars, or you name it. In the early days, people were a bit resistant. Now nobody even thinks about it. So there's legislation there if necessary, but a lot of policy will be based on, can we actually provide people with the tools for them to make those positive choices for themselves? So that's
bringing a different aspect. We could do this through legislation, but there's also other tools available to change behaviours, and could we use some of those as well, which is slightly different, I think, from saying actually this requires legislation to we could do this in a different way. So I think that's another consideration.
There are choices like, concerns about young people vaping, for example. Do you ban vaping?
Mm.
Is that effective? Is it going to just
Yeah,
drive the problem underground? Or do you try and educate people, use other methods so that people
yeah,
decide for themselves not to go down that route?
yeah. Or pricing, those kind of issues as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I really like this question from Nigel. I'm going to put this to you again first, Zoe, and then come to you, James, if you want to add anything, because I think this goes back to the policy making cycle that you were talking about. And Nigel has said, what legal requirements are there on the government of the day to engage the population on defining priorities or setting policies, so on the services they provide? So lobbying is obviously one key route that he's suggested, but actually I think he's talking about consultation. So to what extent is government required to consult on new policies?
It absolutely is, it is obliged to put in place proper consultation processes and timelines around it so that people, anybody can actually respond to a government consultation. Clearly, it's for government to decide on the destination, if you like. So often consultation is about the best means of getting there. So, what ways do people feel that government can best implement a policy? But of course, the government has been elected on a series of manifesto commitments. So that's the first consultation, the election. So they've got that
Right.
mandate. But then, yeah, absolutely. In terms of what that policy is going to look like in practice and how it's going to be implemented, government does have to consult.
And are there kind of minimum criteria for that? So do they have to consult for a certain length of time? Do they have to consult a certain number of people? How does that actually work in practice?
Yeah, they I think it's still 12 weeks consultation period. So, they have to really think about when's the best time to do it. So not over school holidays, for example, if you're
Right.
consulting on an education policy. And yes, I mean, it depends on but they do need to try and get a representative group. So reaching out, and these days, so you need to think about the demographics. If you just do consultation online, you are going to miss a lot of people who are not online themselves. So,
The way
introduce
you run the consultation is important as well.
absolutely.
And James, thanks. Did you want to add anything on consultation? And also, what are the terms green paper, white paper? What does that mean when it comes to kind of a consultation exercise?
Well, to start with that, the idea is that if you as a government are maybe you've set that objective, but you're not sure how to get there. So the idea is you're thinking is at an early stage, you might publish a green paper to just sort of get a discussion going. A white paper is a statement of the government's view about how it will achieve something. So they're both forms of consultation, but potentially at different stages. It's not that you have to go through both, but they're at a different level. I think it's also maybe just worth pulling out that the thing about formal consultation and the obligation government places on itself to consult, there is also an awful lot, and often a far more important set of consultation, which is usually these policy officials, the people who are leading. They're supposed to know more than perhaps anyone else about how the banking system works or how local government finance works, road safety design, all of these things. And that's why there are a lot of subservients. There's a lot to cover. So they will have relationships with people in that world, and they will also be doing a less formal form of consultation. So this is where they would be inviting in some leading people to a workshop, or they will be putting out a consultation document, perhaps just to trade associations or professional bodies. There's an awful lot of that, and that tends to be the place where if you're organized and want to get in there and make changes or have your voice heard, that's probably the place. The more formal consultation, the risk is that at that point, actually the government has made up its mind, so you don't have the chance to influence it, even if you've got the opportunity to send them a piece of paper. So the message is always get in as early as you can, and also try and get in with the right people to talk about it. And yeah, trade bodies are usually a good place to start.
Great, thanks. We've got some great questions coming in. I really like this one from Tony, who has said, what's the difference between a civil servant and a crown servant? I hear both being talked about in engagements that they have with the MOD, for example. And I want to throw in another thing, because it's a term we often use. What's the difference between civil servant, crown servant, and public servant?
Yeah.
So I'm going to throw those three in. Zoe, you're nodding on this one. What's the difference?
It's so confusing, isn't it? So the civil service we talked about, which is there to drive forward the government's agenda for the day. Crown servants are different. They answer to the monarch. So that includes the armed forces, intelligence services. So actually they serve the king rather than the government of the day. And I think, on the principle that if the government suddenly does something disastrous, the army can step in or whatever. So crown servants are different. So if you're working with the MOD, anybody who works in the MOD who is a civil servant is supporting the government, but they also have people working in the Ministry of Defence who are members of the armed services, and obviously they need to work really closely together on defence policy. Public servants is a much wider term. So public servants will include people like the police, people working in the NHS, local government. So anybody who's sort of paid out of a taxpayer's money is a public servant, but they're the sort of operational end of, if you like, the implementation of what government's trying to achieve.
But actually then, is a civil servant a public servant? Is it kind of the term that sits above all of them? All of them?
Yeah, essentially every single one of them is a public servant.
Right.
And yeah, because they're all paid out of the public purse.
Yeah. Great, thanks. James, we've got so many questions. I'm going to put a different question to you. This is going back to Walter. I asked Walter to kind of clarify his question. And I think his question was about, because you mentioned devolution and Walter sent his question in while you were talking about devolution. So I think he's saying, how does government deal with tensions between the different parts of those devolved decision-making kind of structures? So if you've got something coming out of the UK Parliament, but then maybe there are differences then in kind of, Scotland and Wales or anything about how that's delivered or kind of their own priorities. How do we deal with all of that complexity of a devolved decision-making structure?
So it's been a tricky one, really, because clearly it gets potentially very, very political if you have a different government or political persuasion of government in one parliament or assembly rather than another. And we've seen that in recent years, particularly with the debate over whether there should be a referendum in Scotland, where you have a government that's been elected by the people of Scotland going, yes, we do, and a government elected by the people of the UK going, no, we don't. And the way of resolving that is, if it gets really nasty and the lawyers get involved, it's the Supreme Court, and that's the Supreme Court of the UK. But of course, if you're sitting in Scotland and the Supreme Court is several hundred yards away from the Palace of Westminster in London, it may not feel that it's impartially dealing. And this comes back to this issue about there not being a written constitution. There's no effectively enforceable rights beyond the rights that Parliament chooses to give people. So at the top, it can get very complicated. At working level, it tends to be fine. What tends, though, to happen is not that people don't, at the working level, sometimes ministers and certainly officials, it's not that they necessarily have arguments, it's just there's a tendency for Westminster to forget about or not take account of devolution nearly early enough. And there are a lot of problems that can arise from that. There's also issues about finance, so that the extent to which everyone feels they're getting a fair share of the funding can be an issue. So working level, it's generally okay. And it may be that politically, for various reasons, we'll see less confrontation and more collaboration, but you can't know. These are political issues.
Yeah, thanks, James. Zoe, David's question: how does central government ensure that local government executes policy consistently and effectively? Or does central government not really have a view on how local government delivers? I think this comes down to, as what you were saying, the policy cycle doesn't finish with it just being handed out. I think beyond Whitehall is, how do you evaluate and monitor kind of the impact and effectiveness of ultimately of that policy delivery on the ground?
It's such a complex issue, that, because again, rather like James was saying, when you think about devolution, if you've got different political persuasions, from one part of the country to another, that can cause some issues. And I think that's very true when it comes to relationships between central government and local government. Local government actually delivers a huge amount of government policy. It looks after local communities. It provides things like social care. education, huge key parts of any central government policy. And there are some principles. I mean, effectively, government hands over the money and says we want this in return. But I think what we've seen, over recent years is that actually local government has really struggled to deliver, and then it's got to decide there are certain things it has to, by law, deliver. So education, social care being two of them. But if money's tight, then of course they are having to cut other services that they provide that they are not bound to by law, which can leave communities going, well, hang on, I'm paying all this council tax locally and I'm getting nothing back for it because I don't have kids in school or elderly parents who need social care or some of those things. So yeah, it's a complex relationship sometimes.
Yeah, and similarly, James, and then I will come back to because I think we're getting into quite complicated, I think, questions here. So Steph has said, does elected government decide who actually delivers a policy? E.g., does the department, the NHS, a trust or a board deliver a hospital project, for example? So who decides the delivery kind of process? And then Miko has asked a question about, is execution outsourced? So government only cares about the policy and not its execution. So James, your thoughts on who actually decides, like where does the decision come for how that policy will be ultimately delivered through that kind of broader public sector landscape?
So there's two ways it can happen. One of which is you're sitting, you're a minister in the Department of Health and Social Care. You might then go, right, I want a new hospital. You use the existing structures that are there. So you'd go, if it's in England, then we'll use this path. If it's in Scotland, it all looks rather different. So, but in England, you would then be saying, well, we're going to decide. Now, that can change. So if you go back far enough, that sort of capital spending would be given to a regional health authority. They would decide where the hospital went. It wasn't central government doing it. Central government has basically taken over the last 20 or 30 years more and more and more power to itself to make these decisions, and the regional structure, exactly as Zoe was saying with local government, it doesn't have the discretion it once did. It's just given money, but it's also told exactly how to spend it, and there's accountability coming back. So sometimes you do it that way. Other times, government might go, we don't want to use existing delivery mechanisms. We think they're part of the problem. So that, in a way, is one of the reasons why local government perhaps doesn't have some of the powers it once did, or the responsibilities it once did. And so you may set up a new agency. So we saw that about fit notes or sick notes just before the election, the government going, maybe doctors shouldn't be issuing fit notes. Maybe we'll set up a new unit, a new team, a new agency, and they will send them all off to them. So then you're creating a new thing to do the thing that you would otherwise have got the doctors to do. So sometimes those are structural changes, and that might be back then you'd need to legislate. It's going to take a couple of years and so on. So you can have lots of different ways, but the choice is always with the government, and they are always interested in execution, or delivery is usually the term that they would use. So it's a constant thought for them. And I think what we will see is a move from, if you like, because it's a Labour government, they've committed to this, to devolve power in England back towards local government. And I think you'll see huge resistance to that in Whitehall, because that's what we saw last time Labour tried to do this. They did have some success, but they didn't go as far as they originally said they would.
Thanks. And Zoe, building on that then, Miko also asked, so how should a potential partner, a potential supplier, how are they supposed to understand this kind of delivery chain? Where would they go to find out information about that? Because they might want to interact with different bits of that delivery chain. So if there's not a kind of, a one size structure for all of policy delivery, how do they know in specific areas where they should go for people to contact?
I think that's a really complex question, because I think sometimes even civil servants don't quite know who is responsible for handling what, and who they should talk to. But I mean, I think every government department has got a contact point. So you can just send an email to that contact point saying, I am interested in this particular policy area. Can you give me the contact there? And you might start with somebody who's very junior, but if you get to know that it's what they call the grade sevens who typically drive stuff forward in government. So sort of not quite senior civil service, but
Yeah.
they're the ones James was talking about, who are expected to know all about how something works, and are the first person sort of responsible for putting advice to ministers and the like. So you know, it can be quite difficult to find your way in and around, but as long as you can get hold of somebody, they will help you find your way through.
And I imagine, I mean, I know that on every government department website, they do have information about their agencies and their arm's length bodies, don't they? So those would be a good
Absolutely.
place to start to look for further down the supply chain contact.
Absolutely. They will all have an organogram which shows, you know, who's responsible for what in broad terms at senior level within
Yeah.
the department. But yes, absolutely, which of the arm's length bodies, or for example, they are looking after, and who leads on what within those. So, you know, it can be quite easy to access that kind of information.
Yeah. Yeah. And similarly, James, Charles has said, how do you get to know who the specific policy advisors are within certain departments? So those special advisors, no, not special advisors, so the specific policy advisors, so civil servants, I think, in different policy areas. How do you get to know who they are? Apart from, of course, coming to all the Global Government Forum events and meeting them in person. How else would you get to know them, James?
Well, that is where any official at that level ought to have their network of organisations that they're dealing with. So it you know, in a way, there should be a route, and it may not be direct, but there should be a route to be able to, you know, get in the room and start hearing. You may be with others, you may be with a few competitors, but you could get in the room and start to hear. So they should be out and about a bit, and like I said, professional bodies, trade bodies, so organisations that are in there trying to have the voice heard and make those connections, understand what government is looking for, because government, you know, it's sometimes from the other side. If you're in government, you don't feel all powerful, and you don't feel you've got all the levers, and you should and would want to be reaching out to say, we can't do this on our own, how can people help? So although obviously formal procurement can get in the way, and sometimes, you know, for example, if there's a procurement open, you know, a lot of civil servants will go, look, I'm just not taking that phone call, I'm not even answering that email, because there's a risk of contaminating the procurement process. But assuming you aren't in that zone, then if you get to them and you've got something you can trade because they're looking for stuff from you, like, well, how could we solve this problem? Then you get those fruitful conversations going, and you can build up a good working relationship. And it can be one-to-one, or it can be through these representative bodies.
Thanks, James. And also, like Zoe said, the down to a certain level, I think people's details will be on the government department website as well. So they all have very detailed organograms of their own kind of structures as well. And there will be public contact points as well that people can email in. And genuinely, I mean, we do have a lot of great senior civil servants speaking at our events. So Public Sector Data Live, for example, if you're interested in the digital side of things, there will be an opportunity to meet lots of civil servants there, and similarly innovation from across all of the areas as well. Still lots of questions coming in, and there are two that I am going to link together because I think these are really important for our audience. So Mohammed has said, I work in public sector procurement. I'd like to understand the legislation and approval process that government buyers have to go through to sell to suppliers. So any information about procurement. And I know, Zoe and James, this might not be your kind of specialist area. So if that's the case, fine, we can always send some information to Mohammed afterwards. But similarly, Craig has said, how do SMEs get involved when structures are complex and departments already have existing relationships? So how do SMEs kind of get in the door and start those conversations even with civil servants? Who would like to go first on that? Zoe, I'm going to come to you.
I think James was just about to say something.
Oh, right. Sorry, James. James, I'll come to you and then Zoe. James.
Well, it was just to say, do stop me if I start ranting. But as you know, I'm a director of a company that supplies government. We're an SME. It is not easy. One of the things I think I would say about the civil service, I was a civil servant for many years. I love it. I've got many friends in the civil service. It tends to be risk averse. And so, yes, there will be a tendency to go with the big suppliers, the household names, and people they're used to dealing with. So it is difficult to break in, and I, don't let anyone say, oh, we're very, very open to SMEs. They're really not. It's not an area they've managed to crack. So, for example, there are many, many compliance issues, and it's not to attack the underlying reason for having, your environmental statement or your slavery statement. Those are good things, but if you're a sole trader, it's quite tricky. So they have done some things to try and do that. And one of the things is, once you have got a foot in the door and you have shown that you can deliver for government, then the mood changes a bit. You've got a bit of a track record, you can get going. So it is tricky. There are these very formal rules, and there should be. And when we've seen occasions where their rules have been put to one side, it sometimes goes very, very badly wrong. So it's not so much the rules, it's just recognizing it's a hard slog to break in if you haven't done it before, and just get all the help you can. Once you get there, it's great, because you're doing some really important work, and you're doing some very interesting work a lot of the time. You're facing new challenges. So I wouldn't dissuade anyone, but it is, being realistic that it is tricky. I wouldn't, and the other thing is to say the procurement routes vary enormously between different departments and agencies. Some will ask for this, some won't. So again, it's unfortunately there's not a single set of rules. You're really looking at each individual procurement route. You'd have to work out what they are looking for, be really accurate about compliance with what they've demanded, even if it's time consuming, and then hope your product or service is just good enough to break in.
Thanks, James. Zoe, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I totally agree with everything James just said, and one of the some of these bigger organizations that are very used to contracting with government, those relationships are there. Are they able to deliver everything in that contract, or do they need to subcontract things out? And that's where I think SMEs often have an edge, because they provide that niche quality service that the bigger organizations are going to rely quite heavily on. So and then once you've built your reputation through that route as a subcontractor, who knows, you've got that relationship in place.
Just to say, because I think procurement is such an important issue for our audience here, that I think it's definitely going to be something we'll cover in more detail in our other webinars in this series. There are 3 more, I'll tell you about those coming. But also it's something that if you were really interested, we could certainly create some bespoke kind of training for you and your organisation on this, because there are so many elements, as James and Zoe have said, to understand. It's not really very easy to cover on a broader webinar like this, but do get in touch if you want more information on that. So we've still got lots of questions coming in. Some I'm going to group together a lot about the government's relationship globally. So I'm going to do that in a moment. But there's a question first from Simon Gillen, which goes back to, I think, that delivery across kind of out of Whitehall into agencies and the wider public sector. So Simon said, how are organisations like agencies and non-ministerial departments, so those kind of arm's length bodies, how are they held accountable? Do their CEOs, for example, also appear before select committees? What's the process for scrutiny of their performance? So, Zoe, I know you mentioned the importance of evaluation, in that policy cycle, but how do we hold to account not just ministers, but agencies and other delivery bodies?
Yeah, so there are quite a lot of mechanisms for this. When it comes to agencies, there's a kind of contract between a government department and that agency. It's often called sponsorship. So that is effectively saying, we will pay for you to run your operations, but these are the standards we expect from you, and that is quite closely audited. Yes, heads of any of these organisations, select committees in Parliament can summon anybody they want. And they will. And you've got the National Audit Office there, which is it's not a government department, it's a parliamentary department. And it is there actually, it's entirely set up to look at how are different government departments, agencies, other bodies performing? Are they delivering a good service? Are they delivering value for money? And so that is a resource that parliamentarians can draw on, the National Audit Office reports, and of course then they can ask those difficult questions either in select committee or in debates or in oral parliamentary questions which then ministers have to answer to. So, ministers are very conscious of that ultimately they are the ones who are responsible for the entire work of not only their department, but all the agencies attached to it.
Yeah, thanks, Zoe. And also, James, just to say, Christopher Stevens has said, I was a civil servant in procurement for 20 plus years, and this was always a challenge, as James said. But Christopher said, the Procurement Act 2023 is attempting to address this issue, and there's a more overt obligation on public buyers to remove barriers to SMEs in the bidding process. So I think, as you said, there are moves towards trying to make it easier. And I know there's been quite a lot done on digital procurement, for example, the digital marketplace. And I think they've gone from having a small number of large suppliers to hundreds of smaller suppliers because of that shift in the process. So there are definitely positive moves happening, but it's definitely still a complicated and difficult process, I think, for a lot of people to understand. So in the time that we have got left, I just want to move on to some global questions. So I'm going to kind of link all of this. So Lindy has said, how do we make decisions at a global level, whether we are members of and agree with NATO, the UN, etc.? Noted that we don't have MEPs anymore. So how do we make decisions on a global level? Thomas has said, is there a constitutional principle that public international law is binding? So in a conflict between national law and international law, what kind of wins out on that? And then I think there was another question here. So Gerald has said, what are the working relationships and communications or information sharing processes between civil servants in the UK and those in the Commonwealth? So what are the mechanisms in place to share information? So I guess the question I'm asking is, how does the UK government work globally? So with its partners globally, whether that's the Commonwealth or broader around the world, and also kind of in terms of legislation, does international legislation trump national legislation? How does that kind of work? James, you spent some time in Brussels. I know we're no longer in the EU, sadly, but how do all of these global relationships work?
So perhaps it's worth stating that this is something where Parliament actually tends to have less of a grip on the executive, on the government, than domestic stuff. So to some extent, governments can sort of do what they want, and if we don't have quite the thing you'd have in the US where the Senate needs to ratify international agreements. So there's a bit more discretion for government. Technically, Parliament remains sovereign, so national law will always take precedence over international law, and the only way that the EU law took precedence was because Parliament said it could. When we enter the EU, so it tends to be on a sort of legal level, if you want. It reflects a version of the domestic scene, but with a bit more discretion to the government of the day. I think the other thing perhaps to pick out is, again, it ought to be that ministers, because they have these opportunities to meet in sort of global get-togethers, but also officials who, again, should be doing the same thing, and a lot of international bodies that they can meet through, that they should be out there trying to see what other people are doing. We have a lot of shared problems and a lot of need to collaborate. There's some examples of it working very well. There are still some international institutions like the International Maritime Office based in London. These are great ways of the UK being influential. But I think it's sometimes people would say that British officials are dumb, and maybe ministers, they haven't been as influential as they have been in the past. It has tailed away a bit, and it does require some effort, and it also requires an effort of mind. So I think it's often really surprising where you see bits of government that just haven't looked at how other countries are dealing with the same problems. As I said, when they do it, and they usually will do, but you do find times when you just think that's a real gap. So they're not made to do it. You can have a policy here and not ever have looked at what another country is doing and kind of ignored the international consensus, if you like, on a topic. So lots of discretion.
Thanks. So did you want to add? I mean, one thing we haven't talked about is kind of the role, I guess, of diplomats and kind of that whole network of kind of influence and maybe information gathering as well through the Foreign Office.
Yeah, sure. So, we've talked quite a bit about the levers that governments can pull, to bring about change in domestic policy. the thing about diplomacy is that you just haven't got those levers at all. It's all about trying to understand other people's positions, negotiation, listening, soft skill stuff. So it's a completely different skill set, I would say, from a lot of. I mean, I went from Treasury, where it's got very hard levers it can pull in policy terms, and to the diplomatic service, where that just doesn't happen. So it's all about understanding the other person, the other side's position, the cultural implications, why is this happening there? How is that government dealing with it? Is there something we can offer to help unlock those problems? So there's a lot of trading, and it takes a long time often to effect those changes. But and of course, much more. There were other things like sort of the United Nations Security Council, where we've got a seat at the heart of it, where actually we can put out position statements and things. But a lot of the everyday work is about negotiation, trade-offs, listening.
And I think we saw during the last Parliament. I think it's very controversial, isn't it, when the UK Parliament does something that looks like it's breaching international legislation. So I think that causes a lot of controversy. And also, I think what we are seeing already, maybe with the new government coming in, is that they want to, talking about Europe, for example, which one of the questions mentioned, have closer ties again with some of the organisations that are in Europe. So whether we're not even officially in the EU, being around the table for some of those conversations, I think we'll see more of that, I think, over the coming months and years. Thank you so much. We've got Pippa just saying there, again, coming back on SME, I think this issue of procurement is really, really important. So Pippa is saying, yes, she agrees that some things are working to remove some of the barriers for SMEs, but still a lot of frustration about how difficult it is, I think, for SMEs to really interact, and frustrating as they can offer a high quality service, typically at far lower costs than I think some of the suppliers that are already there. So Pippa, we will take that away, and I'll see what more we can do in our follow-up webinars specifically on the issue of procurement. I think we have gone through all of our questions. Thank you so much to the audience for sending in all of their questions. If you have another question, now is your moment. If not, I think we are coming to the end of the time for our webinar today. I have been mentioning throughout the conversation that we have these other webinars that we are planning to run, all again looking at how government works. So the first of those, we've got the date set for the first of those, and it's going to be on Friday the 23rd of August, where we're going to be doing a deeper dive into governance, regulation and culture. And I think some of the things we're going to really cover there are, and some of these came up today, the issue of the civil service code, the ministerial code. So how are civil servants and ministers supposed to act? What are the kind of codes under which they are supposed to operate? The values, Chloe, you touched on these, that integrity, honesty, objectivity and impartiality. What does that actually mean in practice for civil servants? And then it does say there the legal framework for procurement. So maybe we will make sure that we go into more detail on that in the webinar in August. And then just so that you know, give you a heads up, the other two webinars that we're planning will be later on in the year, and they're going to be looking at kind of operations and process. So going into more detail on that kind of the legislative processes, and then the delivery, how do you actually deliver services out into the ground? And then finally, I think once this government have had a chance to really get in and kind of make some of the changes that they want to make, we're going to do a final webinar on the impact of the new government on Westminster and Whitehall, looking at kind of maybe some of the machinery of government changes that they've put in place, maybe changes to the culture across Whitehall. And also they're talking about some reforms to things like the House of Lords as well. So what does that actually mean in practice? So I think a lot more information to come going forward. But I hope you've enjoyed that today. I hope that has been useful to everybody in the audience. We will send you all of those links and all of the information that we mentioned today. I just want to say a huge thanks to James and to Zoe. It's been fantastic to have you here today to share your kind of own personal experiences and expertise with us. To everybody, enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are. And I hope we do see you at some more of our webinars and also at some of the events and other channels that we mentioned during today's conversation. Thanks, James. Thanks, Zoe. Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you.